Today we're going to go over how to use the Kreg Router Table as an edge jointer, meaning we want to get the edges of the boards to be straight and flat. Now Kreg provides a way to do this. With your table you will find these two rods. They store nicely in the back alongside a little insert. Now to do this you're going to need obviously the Kreg Router Table and the fence, these two black bars, either a spiral bit or some type of straight bit. This is a flush trim bit, but it has a straight bit obviously on it, so I generally use it if I'm going to do my jointing in this method. I generally now do my jointing on the table saw, but for a long time I did it on here. So I'm going to go through how to do this. You also are going to need obviously your piece of wood that you want to joint, and I highly suggest early on a piece of scrap wood to get this set up, because it can take a little working back and forth before you really know what you're trying to go for. Today we're going to joint two pieces of wood that are a little different. This is soft maple and it's about 7/8, and it's got a rough sawmill edge on there. Nothing's been done to this. This is a piece of SPF from Home Depot. Obviously it's really banged up and rough edge, so we're going to do that as well. However, the difference here is that this piece has been face jointed with the planer sled and this one hasn't. Now this is important because the better your jointing ends up is going to really depend on how flat your wood already is. Now I know this can be a real problem, so for a lot of people who don't have a planer or a jointer itself. So what we're going to do is use this then, in the case of this which has a twist, to just get the edge straight. But it's very unlikely if you have a twisted or warped piece that you're going to be able to get this 90 degrees to the face, but you will be able to get it straight. So I just want to go in knowing that the expectations, if you do not have a way to face joint the wood, and you can see this in the use of a real jointer, in that you face joint the wood first and then you flip it up and you go across the jointer. That's because you generally want a flat reference surface to ride across. But I know most people who are using this for jointing don't have a planer and don't have a jointer, so you're using this instead. So we'll go through this with both a face jointed piece and an unface jointed piece. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put either our spiral or a straight bit into here. And like I said, I occasionally use this flush trim bit because it is essentially a straight bit and it has a longer cutting length than most of my straight bits do. You generally need a bit obviously that's going to be taller by just a hair than your wood. So take that into consideration before you start cutting into it, that you obviously need the cutter head to be taller than the wood. So we're going to put these in there. We'll show each different one to show you how it works. And then we're also going to take the smallest insert. Now I have the router lift, but it makes no difference. When I was using this, I used it with just the generic insert plate that came with it. So ignore the fact that this is the lift. That doesn't really matter at all. Now I'm going to start with the straight bit here, and what we want to make sure is that our bit is sticking out enough. Obviously not a dangerous amount, but enough that the entire cutting edge can be above the table if our piece is just as high or just slightly under this itself. You need the cutter head sticking out enough. So in your prep, take that into consideration about whether this cutting edge is high enough out as you're putting it in the router. As a general rule of thumb, of course, you obviously don't want it sticking out a ton. Generally, the safety rule is, drop it down to the bottom, pull it up a 1/16, no more than an eighth of an inch. So we'll go with that. All right, so I've gone ahead and I've now got this in there, and we're going to start with the straight bit and the unface jointed one because I know a lot of people are just going to be using that. They don't have a spiral bit and they probably don't have a way to face joint. So what we want to make sure is our bit height here is that we're just clearing the height of this wood. However, take note, if you've got a twisted piece that's got one side that's higher than the other, make sure it's going to clear on both sides as you're going across. You don't want to end up with one higher than the other. That's no longer going to meet the top of the cutter head. So that looks pretty good for me, and we'll see when we do our test cut. Note, I've already got the smaller insert in here now too, so make sure you do that. And that's really just for stability. We don't want to use the big one and have the ability to dip into it or get caught on it. The next thing we are going to do is put these two in. Now take note of which way I'm standing facing this. We are going to be cutting this direction. So we will be shimming this essentially out on the left side, so your outfeed side. Just remember that as you go along. Outfeed is going to be shimmed. And what we're essentially going to do here is we're going to look at this fence, and we're going to see these two holes here and these two holes here. Now one is slightly deeper than the other to determine the depth of cut you want to take. I'm going to stick mine in the deeper ones, the one on top and the one on the bottom here, to take a shallower pass. The next thing we're going to do is move this down, and now we will adjust where these go. We want obviously as small of a gap as possible on either side. So get it as close as you can go without obviously sacrificing ripping your fence. And we'll tighten that up. We may have to adjust it again a little later. And we will put this one in a little closer. We've got a very narrow gap in there now. And what we want to make sure is we have the reference surface on either side. We don't want the board to be able to swing in there at all. So we've now got this shimmed out. And so what I like to do is that on these flush trim bits, we know that the bearing meets the blade. So you set this such that you are offset on the exit side. You want to have this flush with the one you just jettisoned out, because as we come in, we're removing some, and we want that to meet exactly with this. And this is the part that takes some fine tuning, is to get this perfectly flush. You get it as close as you can to start. I like just having a good straight edge to do it. You just want to get it so that this bearing is barely moving. Barely moving. You don't want to be rolling the bearing as you come along, and you don't want to be able to tilt the ruler or straight edge into it. Just barely glancing it. And this will be our starting position. So we're going to start from here. We're now going to double check again to make sure that these aren't going to hit at all. It looks like I can move this one even a little bit more. And again, don't be super risky with this, obviously. You don't want to destroy your fence boards here. And then obviously with the router off, we're just going to twist this and make sure we're not going to hit. Yep, we're not going to hit. All right, so now we're going to make our initial test cut on our scrap piece of wood. And what I like to do is I like to just draw a line, a squiggle line down this, so that we know what we're taking off and if we're missing anything. And we'll obviously check whether this is flat on whatever the flattest surface you have. Often that's the table saw. And so if you have a small piece like this, it doesn't hurt to put a feather board here behind the cutter and help hold this. But obviously sometimes you want to do a piece that's significantly wider than where you can get your feather board. So you could possibly clamp something here to help. But oftentimes if you're straight, your edges are not straight on either side, so it's tricky. So with the test piece, I'm just going to leave the feather board out. When we come through, I really like to use these, which are slightly angled push blocks, so that my hands are pushing in. And we're going to come through here, and we're going to keep pressure on this fence at first. And once we start making contact with this other fence, then we will start applying pressure to each. And as we get closer to the exit, we're going to be applying almost all of our pressure onto this fence. If you are still applying pressure here, you're going to tilt your wood. So you have to kind of move your pressure as you go along. Pressure here, starting to put pressure here. And now we want pressure over here. Ideally, you don't want to be moving your hands at all. You want this to be in one clean motion. One thing we want to think about ahead of time is where we're going to stand. Obviously, we don't want to have to move too much. However, if you're using quite a long piece, it's going to be hard to stand here, right? It's going to be hard to keep that pressure. So oftentimes I like to start off a little bit to the side and not necessarily move my feet, but just move my body as I come through this and try to keep as still as possible, but also being able to shift my weight. So my legs are kind of spread apart so that I can shift my weight as I come through. If you have a very large piece, you're going to have to come from the side and do it this way, right? It's just there's no way you're going to be able to hold this up. On a smaller piece, you can generally just stand in the middle and use arms, but you do want some downward force. So make sure you're lined up such that it's not all arms. We're not going to be crushing this thing in there, but we want to make sure that this is not coming away from the fence at all. Now, one thing I will add is that going from a really rough surface is going to take a little while. We're definitely going to use dust collection on this to keep the chips out of there. And we're going to go through now and do our test cut on this test piece. Remember, we've marked up one side here, and we'll see how that goes, see where we're at, see if we need to play with where this fence is at. One thing I want to mention right away that's a bit of a troubleshooting is if you're coming through and you run into this, just stop. Stop, you've got this too far forward. We're going to have to back it off a bit. So if on your initial cut you're just hitting it as you're coming through, don't try to force through the rest of this. It's going to make just a concave cut because it'll be as if it's going over and around. So that is a good way to know right away. Another way we'll know is if when we're going over, this is actually falling into this. We want it to seem as if this fence is not jutted out at all. When we go through, if this is set up right, it should feel like a solid fence all the way through, even though this one is further forward. That's the goal we're aiming for with our distance here away from the bit. So we're going to check one more time to make sure that that's not going to hit. And we're going to plug the router in and we're going to go from there. I would suggest dust mask, eye protection, ear protection, and if you're using a long piece, you're going to need somewhere for it to be supported. So make sure you've got something, even if it's just a pile of books on the other side, to catch this piece as it goes through. I generally don't and didn't try to join anything that was like longer than this table really, just because I don't have a roller or anything. But you could, in theory, do quite a long piece as long as you have in-feed and out-feed support for you to maintain your standing here. Okay, after our first run, we've removed this so far. You can see that this is deeper because this is a relatively rough edge as well. Now I noticed I got just a hair of bump here, so I'm going to move this back just a hair, and we may end up being back too far, and we'll have to readjust again. But if you're hitting this, that means that this is further out than the bit, so you have to go back. If you are realizing there's a gap and you're turning in, you are too far back and you need to come forwards. So we're going to go a hair back here. The thing I love about this table is all these dots on it. I think they're meant to lower friction, but you can almost use them as measuring tools to just get a visual idea of how far back you're going. We'll do our second cut here. And again, if your board is pretty rough, it's going to take multiple passes to clean this up. Okay, so it took me about 7, maybe 8 passes to get this pencil all removed. It's incredibly smooth. I checked it on my table saw. It's really flat. We're not getting any movement in the middle. I'm very happy with that. I had to readjust this about 2 times to get it right. I obviously didn't show all of that because it's just lengthy, but I'm just barely grazing that. So I'm going to go through now and I'm going to do this larger piece of wood, and also the results of something that's not face jointed. This has got a pretty heavy twist in it. This isn't the safest way in the world to do this. Perhaps if you have a hand plane, taking some of this off is great, but I know a lot of people just don't have those things, and you're going to do this anyway, so I'm just going to show you how to do it. It's not dangerous per se, it's just obviously better overall if everything's flat. Okay, we've done this first piece, and this board is jointed. However, I'm going to show you what it looks like when you have a twist in there. When we put this down, we're going to notice that it looks like there's a gap there. However, that gap disappears as soon as you tilt it, because you're now putting it on the thinnest part, which is straight, right? You have it back, and because the twist is there, it means as you're going through and you're placing pressure in different areas, it's moving this back and forth. So this, though, is when we can take this to our table saw. And again, ideally you'd have flat faces for all of this because that's the safest way to do it. But you can run this through your table saw now and you will get a straight edge on this side, and then you can go back and cut it to width. So if your piece is twisted, it's going to look like it's perhaps not flat and straight. Incredibly smooth surface on here. Obviously a new fresh router bit is great, a sharp one. If you plan to do a lot of jointing on your router, I suggest, just like with a bandsaw and resawing, keeping a router bit just purely for that. We're now going to walk through the spiral bit and the soft maple. I'm now going to switch to the spiral bit. And the setup for this is a little trickier because you don't have the bearing or a perfectly straight edge to reference off of. Now again, this is our outfeed side. We're going to try to line that up with, I generally use the tip of this, the outside tip, as it's the most obviously outside spot, but really anywhere on this cutting edge will be okay. So you're just going to, do your best. It will definitely take some adjustment with the spiral bit, because it's just not as easy as with the bearing. As you tighten these down, always double check that they're not moving at all while you're doing it. You can spin, we've got this pretty in tight. We'll go ahead and make a test cut and then see where we're at. Alright, it took me a couple adjustments there, but the test cut is all done. Interestingly, I can feel I must have a nick somewhere in that router bit, because I can feel a line down here, almost like on a planer when you have a nick. So just be wary of that. Not really an issue. This is flat, tested on the table saw. So now we're going to do this piece of soft maple, which is about the entire cutting height of this bit, just a little under, and very rough, just still sawmill rough. And this is where it gets more interesting, when you've got some real roughness in there, as much like a jointer, every pass is going to be taking a little off over and over until you're flat. But when you have it pretty rough, you've got to really be careful and pay attention to going against these fences here to make sure you're not tipping in or pulling out at all, especially for the first couple passes. And the key to doing this really is just keeping that steady pace. Just you can feel this when you're moving it all, if you're dipping in. So really kind of let the feel of your hands going through this with your push blocks, obviously, and we'll see how this goes. We'll see how many passes it takes us. Remember, we are taking off only the, I believe, 30-second amount. I think there is a larger one. So if you're, I don't know, in a rush, or you just want to take off more at once, you can put the shims in the other slots and take off more each time. Obviously, you'll have to adjust how far this is away, but you can take off more if you want. I would definitely suggest that you make sure you have a powerful enough router if you're going to take off quite a bit of hardwood, a 2 horsepower, 2.25 horsepower. I'm not sure I'd try to do this on harder wood this tall with something that's under 2 horsepower, but it may work just fine. So you can see after the first pass here, I've still got some roughness here, here, and then definitely down here, which means this dips down here. I've got some here. So not bad for a first pass. Obviously, it'll probably take 2, maybe 3 more. As you're getting down pretty close, it does help, again, to put some marks onto this just to be really sure, especially on the very end here, so that you know for sure you're hitting it, because sometimes as you get closer, it can kind of blend in and you can't tell. Okay, so not bad, about 4 passes. Now we have something interesting here that I want to point out as we go into troubleshooting. We've got a little tear out in this curl here on the end. Now if you're getting that as a problem, flip it over and try going the other way. Sometimes you're trying to read the grain here, which direction we're slanting up. And we want to attempt to go so that the bit is, as the grain is going up, much like a planer. Again, same concept. The sharper the router bit, the better. This is sort of my beater bit, so it's not the best one. And this really isn't significant. A little sanding will take that out. But if you're trying to get a finished edge right from this, sharp bit, and make sure that you're going with the correct grain direction. You can see a little tear out along that figure right there. Not bad, but something you have to take into consideration because it can chunk out sometimes. Right, so this is the basic premise of how to do jointing on your Kreg router table, and really this would work for any router table. I just happen to have this specific one. It's the same premise. This comes out farther the outfeed side, meets the exact amount being cut off, and you run it through until your board is flat and straight. One of the areas to be careful here that when I was starting early on I had problems with was dipping in on the entrance and dipping out on the exit, and you'd get kind of a dip and a dip right there. So if you're noticing when you go to put this on a flat surface that you've got little dips here and here, just keep playing with where you're putting your pressure, right? You don't want to be overexerting it all on this side when you're over here, and you want to try to keep it as you're coming across. You know, we start pressure here, pressure there. As we come, pressure here, and then we move the pressure to here. Worst case scenario, don't do this with your final length, and if you just can't get those little dips out, just chop them off on the cross cut when you cut to length. But with some practice, you definitely should be able to do it. Another thing to take note of on this table, I just want to do a last reminder, is that if you are hitting this wall, you need to move the fence back on the outfeed side. On the left side, if you're seeing too big of a gap on this side such that you could kind of push in and bring this out, you need to bring the fence further forward because you're taking out a larger cut than you are having this equal on this side. Dust collection helps. And the final thing is that you can use really any diameter of bit. I just happen to have mostly 1/4 inch bits. 1/2 inch, 3/4, you know, whatever is fine to do this. Straight, spiral, flush trim, whatever has essentially a straight cut on it is fine to use. Don't expect to be going as quickly the harder your wood gets. You can also get burning on this if your bit is dull, so make sure it's clean. And I generally do the speed to 6, or whatever the max speed is on these bits. I've never had a reason to go slower, but if for some reason you're encountering problems that can't be explained, burning even though you're moving at a good rate, kick it down to 5 and just see if that helps. There shouldn't really be a need to do so because the diameter is small enough that you can go at max RPMs, but that's also something to try. Another thing that can really help is to make sure that these are almost flush. We still want this side being a hair above this table so that we're not catching on it, and we still want this side to be a hair under. But if you're getting some kind of weird, it's not coming out flat. If it just something's wrong with it, check to make sure these are correct, either perfectly flush or slightly under, slightly over. Make sure that you're not dipping forward into this insert if you're using a larger one. Make sure that your dust collection is pulling away the dust and you're not running into chips over here that are pushing this out. Kind of everything you would normally troubleshoot on a router, just take the consideration of all of those. And if you are getting a weird angled cut, you know, you're at like an angle, it's probably because this isn't flat or for some reason your router is not level to the table. But it's generally because the wood isn't flat. This piece was face jointed, so this is going to end up almost certainly at 90 degrees. But the more twisted, cupped, warped, whatever your wood is, you're going to get a straight edge. It's just not going to be perfectly flat and straight in at 90 degrees. It'll have kind of angled dips throughout it as you move the wood across. So, you know, just something to think about as to what the capabilities of this are with the limitations you have as your other tools. You cannot use this to cut a board to width. You can't just joint both sides. It's highly likely they will not be perfectly parallel. So this isn't a way to get your board to width. You can't just joint both sides. You joint one, and much like a regular jointer, you then take it to the table saw and you rip the other one. So just make sure that you're not trying to joint both sides of this because you will end up most likely with a board that gets narrower or wider, narrower at some part. At the very end, when you're all done, make sure you turn your router off, unplug it, and then removing these can be a bit awkward. I like to use a bent paper clip and go in this way and either try to push from this side and then have them come out here, or push from here and then give them a nice tap and they'll usually slide out. And once we have this out, remember there's storage on the back for these little pieces. They slide in right in here and they both fit inside this storage area. So it's a great way to not lose track of these goofy little rods. Thanks. If you have any questions, let me know.